Magic is something that we commonly see through all types of fiction and works of fantasy. Most of the time, it provides us with a major plot device. It allows us to submerge ourselves in a world that feels familiar, but yet unique and fantastical. In works of fantasy and fiction, it's common to see magic described as light and dark, good and evil. There are acceptable practices, and then those that are taboo. The subject of this video is necromancy, a practice that many classify as black magic or dark witchcraft. A school of magic that should not be practiced, but that wasn't always the case. And so today we'll take a look at some of the origins of necromancy, how it evolved, and what examples we have today. Before we go any further, we first need to define necromancy. The term itself refers to a practice of magic that centers around communicating with the dead. This can involve summoning their spirit, or even raising their entire body, as the spirit would no longer be considered part of our world. It's believed they would have access to the past, present, and future. Raising them physically is something we see from those who perhaps wish to bring a loved one back from the dead. Or in some cases, they're even used as a weapon to do the bidding of their master. The word itself originated from the Latin necromantia, which was taken from the Greek necromantia or necromanthia, which meant divination by the means of a dead body. This takes us to some of the earliest accounts of necromancy, which took place in Greece and Rome, along with Egypt and Babylonia. These practices are often compared to shamanism, and there was no stigma or notion of wrongdoing when it came to necromancy. This is something that came much later. There was a practice in ancient Greece called nekia, or anekia, which essentially was a rite or a ritual where the dead would be called upon to answer questions about the future. One of the earliest examples we have of this particular kind of necromancy comes from Homer's Odyssey, where we see the powerful sorceress Circe, who is capable of both the raising and communion with the dead. Circe then teaches many of these spells to Odysseus, the hero of the story. She then advises him to travel to the underworld and to perform a nekia in order, advising him not to eat the cattle of Apollo to avoid incurring his wrath. He also tells him that he will return home alone with none of his crew. We can see from this particular example that necromancy wasn't seen as an evil form of magic. Almost quite the opposite. This type of necromancy would be used by numerous Greek and Roman poets who would include these rituals in their stories. It became somewhat of a common trope for Greek and Roman heroes to perform a katabasis, a physical journey to the underworld that involved performing a task or a quest. In many cases, communion with the dead. Those bringing the dead back to life were referred to as necromancers, and it seemed, when it came to summoning one's body, they would mainly focus on those who had died recently, within a year or two. Rituals of necromancy did tend to vary. As we saw in Homer's Odyssey, they can be grotesque, involving animal sacrifice and sometimes even mutilation and consumption of the dead. Other times involves practices such as wearing the clothing of the deceased and consuming food such as blackened bread and unfermented grape juice, which was thought to symbolize the decay and lifelessness of death. It was fairly common practice to see artifacts such as talismans and wands used alongside these incantations. So when did necromancy become this dark art? The school of magic that was considered unacceptable or taboo? Most sources point towards a time period of medieval Europe, when the church really began to crack down on magic and witchcraft. Necromancy was one of those practices to be condemned as dangerous. The church labeled the act of necromancy as maleficium, an act of witchcraft, where the intention of doing harm. Necromancy would be equated to raising demons, who hid under the guise of spirits. The church believed that resurrection itself was an act that could only be performed with the assistance of God. And interestingly enough, there were a number of clergy who did perform certain degrees of necromancy. These practitioners were almost always highly trained and educated in astrology, demonology, and exorcism, combing the Christian, Jewish, and Arabic teachings that centered around necromancy. Practitioners of necromancy, or necromancers, outlined 3 things they believed could be achieved through the practice: knowledge, illusion, and the ability to believe in these stories. But I believe they created and inspired interesting ideas and archetypes that we used and still use today in storytelling. And that segues nicely onto the next part of the video. Having discussed what necromancy is, where it came from, and how it's changed, we can now take a look at some more modern examples and how the archetype of a necromancer is used today. For those of you who have been watching this video and waiting for examples of necromancers, there are quite a few that appear in big franchises that you likely would have heard of or seen before. One that many of us would have come across in recent times is Tolkien's character Sauron, the Dark Lord, who went by many titles. One of these, of course, being the Necromancer. Those who have watched the movies and maybe read some of the books may be wondering why he was given this title. Because raising the dead isn't something we really see in any of the movies. However, in the history of Middle-earth, a series of volumes collected by Tolkien, son from all of his father's manuscripts, in Volume 10, Morgoth's Ring, we see a quote that tells us he is indeed capable of communion with the dead, enslaving them and harnessing their knowledge. If we take a look at the Mortal Kombat franchise, we have Shang Tsung and Quan Chi Hu. Both assumed roles of warlocks and sorcerers who dabble in the art of necromancy. In both their cases, they focus on raising the dead to form armies for their master and ultimately do their bidding. Raising an army of undead is honestly something that we see from most necromancers. In Harry Potter, we of course have Lord Voldemort, a wizard who did practice necromancy, raising an entire army of skeletons and zombies during the First Wizarding War, which consisted mostly of those he had already murdered. We also see something similar to this with the White Walkers and the Night King of Game of Thrones, who can raise the dead by simply lifting his arms. Now, all of these examples so far definitely have evil intentions, and they are the villains of their respected stories. But as we've already seen, necromancy wasn't always considered a dark art, and not all necromancers are depicted as evil. We've already discussed the story of Odysseus, who is the hero.
I think it comes down to the fact that they just make really good villains. When you defeat the villain's army, you expect the battle or the war to be over. But with necromancers, they're capable of summoning entire new armies from the corpses. Given this feeling of hopelessness, they also have a level of knowledge obtained through communing with the dead that makes them more than just a formidable enemy. There is also this taboo when it comes to messing of the dead and just leaving them to rest in peace. Thus, the act of raising the dead can be seen as disrespectful and even evil in some cases. There are some aspects of necromancy that we don't always have to view through a lens of ill intent, such as communicating with the dead. I mean, sure, this is still an aspect that can be used in a negative way, but someone wanting closure for a close friend or a loved one is something that most of us can relate to. How you choose to view necromancy is ultimately your choice, but hopefully this video has been informative. I'm sure those of you who are unfamiliar with the necromancy archetype will start to notice it a lot more in your favorite stories. Feel free to share your favorite necromancers or even just your thoughts with me in the comments below. As always,